They wore crowns. They commanded armies. They were believed to rule by divine right. And yet, some of them found themselves behind iron bars, stripped of power, betrayed by allies, and forced to stare at stone walls instead of golden thrones. Imagine the silence after centuries of trumpets, the eerie hush that follows the roar of the court, the sudden loneliness of a man once called Your Majesty, now just prisoner. It's easy to think of kings as untouchable, elevated, immune to the world's chaos. But history has a wicked sense of humor, and sometimes the most powerful men end up with shackles on their wrists. Let's begin in France, with the fate of a monarch so miscalculated it became the blueprint for how not to rule a country on the brink. Louis XVI was never meant to be king. Shy, indecisive, and more interested in locksmithing than ruling, he ascended the throne in 1774, just as France was sliding toward revolution. His court at Versailles was a dazzling cage of decadence, while the people of Paris starved. But Louis believed in order, tradition, and that the world outside his palace could be held at bay with ceremony and prayer. It could not. By 1791, the French Revolution was well underway. Louis, fearing for his safety, disguised himself and his family and attempted to flee to Austria in the now infamous Flight to Varennes. But he was recognized by a postmaster who had seen the king's face on currency, proof that even in disguise, royalty carries a price. The king was arrested, dragged back to Paris, and imprisoned in the Tuileries Palace. Later, he was confined to the Temple, a gloomy medieval tower in the city's heart. There, the man who once ruled over 28 million people lived like a caged animal. Guards mocked him. His meals were rationed. His son, the Dauphin, was taken from him. And as revolutionaries debated whether a king could stand trial as a citizen, Louis wrote in his journal, "Rien," nothing, on the day of his arrest, a symbol of how little control he still held. Eventually, he was convicted of treason and sent to the guillotine in January 1793. But his imprisonment wasn't just the fall of a king. It was the death of the idea that monarchs were above the law. Yet Louis was hardly the only ruler to discover that crowns offer little protection when the world turns upside down. Jump back a few centuries and cross the Channel, and we meet another king who lost control of the throne, this time to his own son. Edward II of England was a man better suited to tournaments than treaties. He alienated his nobles with favorites like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer, and his military leadership was nothing short of disastrous. The Scots routed him at Bannockburn in 1314, and his inability to assert authority led to spiraling resentment. But it was his wife, Queen Isabella, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, who dealt the final blow. Disgusted by Edward's obsession with Despencer, and enraged by her own marginalization, she joined forces with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and led an invasion of England in 1326. Edward was abandoned by nearly everyone. His allies fled. His power evaporated. He was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. The deposed king was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in a remote corner of Gloucestershire. It's said he was kept in squalor, isolated, and possibly tortured. His captors wanted him to vanish, but not to become a martyr. According to a particularly gruesome legend, almost certainly apocryphal, he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body to ensure no visible wounds. Whether or not this is true, Edward died in captivity, his dignity long gone, a king reduced to a cautionary tale. Now shift east to a very different kind of ruler, a man whose dreams were grander than any crown, and whose fall came not from a foreign army, but a secret betrayal. Ivan VI of Russia was only 2 months old when he was declared emperor in 1740. He never ruled. He never walked the halls of power with conscious thought. Instead, he became a living symbol, a threat to others' ambitions, After a palace coup by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, the infant Tsar was deposed and imprisoned. For the next 23 years, Ivan was kept in solitary confinement, shuffled between fortresses under heavy guard. His name was erased from official history. No portraits were allowed. He was treated less like a prisoner and more like a state secret. Only one thing kept him alive: the fear of what might happen if he died. Elizabeth and her successors knew that killing him might inspire revolt. So Ivan remained alone and invisible. That is, until a young officer, unaware of who he was dealing with, discovered the mysterious prisoner at Schlesselburg Fortress. When Catherine the Great seized power in 1762, she issued secret orders. If anyone attempted to free Ivan, he was to be killed immediately. In 1764, 2 lieutenants tried. They failed. Ivan, now 23, was stabbed to death by his guards. He had spent his entire life behind bars for crimes he was too young to even understand. But not all imprisoned kings ended in death. Some endured, and one even staged the ultimate comeback. In 1649, Charles I of England became the first king in European history to be tried and executed by his own people. His death shocked the continent. Monarchs watched in horror as the blade fell, proof that rebellion could end in regicide. But the story didn't end there. His son, Charles II, lived in exile for over a decade. England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, then fell into chaos after his death. And when the dust settled, the people begged the monarchy to return. Charles II marched into London in 1660, not in chains, but in triumph. Yet his years in hiding and exile had changed him. He ruled with wit, caution, and a taste for pleasure, earning the nickname the Merry Monarch. His reign was not revenge, it was resurrection. Even so, the threat of imprisonment never left royal minds. Consider Napoleon Bonaparte, crowned emperor not by birth, but ambition. He rose like a meteor and fell like one too, after a string of military defeats and disastrous campaigns. In 1814, he was exiled to Elba, a small Mediterranean island. He escaped less than a year later, reclaimed power for 100 days, and then lost everything at Waterloo. This time, the victors made sure he couldn't return. They sent him to St. Helena, a wind-battered rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. He was guarded by thousands of soldiers, watched constantly, and confined in a drafty house filled with rats and mold. There was no escape this time. He died in 1821, his body riddled with ulcers and possibly poisoned by the very wallpaper in his room. A man who had once crowned himself emperor, dying slowly on an island that didn't even have trees. From royal birthrights to battlefield crowns, history has shown that the higher the throne, the longer the fall. But perhaps the most bitter imprisonment came not from war or betrayal, but from family. Queen Christina of Sweden was brilliant, eccentric, and wholly uninterested in playing the role expected of her. She refused to marry, surrounded herself with philosophers and artists, and shocked Europe by abdicating her throne in 1654. Officially, she claimed exhaustion. Privately, she had converted to Catholicism and could no longer serve as a Protestant monarch. She wandered Europe, eventually settling in Rome. But her dramatic flair and political maneuvering caused problems wherever she went. Years later, she returned to Sweden, briefly, and attempted to reclaim power. Her cousin, now king, had her confined in a castle under house arrest. It was a gilded prison, yes, but a prison nonetheless. Christina died in Rome, still defiant, still unusual. She had once ruled one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms and walked away from it. But in the end, even her refusal to play by the rules earned her chains. So, what do these stories tell us? That power is never permanent. That crowns do not grant immunity. and that even the greatest rulers with palaces and armies and portraits in gold frames can find themselves surrounded not by courtiers, but by guards, kings in jail, emperors on trial, monarchs betrayed, forgotten, murdered, or left to rot. It is the ultimate reminder that history, unlike fairy tales, does not always promise a happily ever after. Sometimes it just ends in a locked door,